human, resilience, risk, and the social brain. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Troy. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana, and hello to everybody. I had the good luck of being able to sort of review the list a couple of days ago of people that had signed up, and it was really quite fun to see a lot of familiar names, and it also made me a bit sad that those of us that would have been gathering together today for the reunion were not able to do so. I hope we can do this together next year. So there are many reasons that I'm grateful for my time at Lawrence. And actually, Shana, I'm just going to ask, are we both on the screen at the moment? Because I just want to.
I had turned my video off,
okay.
So I'm guessing
Good.
I'm off the screen.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. I trust you all be a generous audience as we sort of figure out how to do some of these things remotely. But I was saying that I have many reasons to be grateful for my time at Lawrence. Certainly, you know, to have so many friends and family even, you know, participating virtually in something like this is among them. I think that's a pretty remarkable thing 40 years later. Another reason that I'm grateful for my time at Lawrence was that I had the good fortune to receive a Watson Fellowship, and that allowed me to pursue a question that had begun to form in my mind as a student at Lawrence. And you know, in fact, I think it was the freedom and even the encouragement I received at Lawrence that allowed me to think about things that weren't in the classroom, but were relevant to everything else that I was learning. And the question basically was this: why, under conditions of adversity and risk, do some children demonstrate remarkable resilience, and other children, in the face of that risk, demonstrate compromised development and even disorder? It seemed to me intuitively that that would be a rich vein to mine in terms of understanding development and mental health, and what we ought to do to help others. And so that question took me to Belfast, Northern Ireland, where I was able to work with kids during the Troubles, and then come back and go to graduate school. And so, and now I'm a clinical psychologist. I am part of the staff at Children's Hospital Minnesota, where I am the medical director for behavioral health services and the associate medical director for the Neuroscience Institute. So I've had a career here as a clinician, also as an administrator, and able to channel efforts to build programs. But I've also been able to keep my hand in research, teaching, and writing some. And it's really that intersection of the clinical, sort of interesting research questions, and how do we talk about it and share it, that has informed my career up to this point. So I'm going to switch for about 20 minutes or so into kind of a slide presentation. So I apologize for shrinking, but I want to kind of share with you some of what I've learned along the way. I want to leave time, plenty of time at the end for discussion. And before I do that, I also want to just acknowledge that I think this stuff's interesting, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to share it. But I'm also aware that this is rather an extraordinary time for all of us. You know, we have pandemic that we're dealing with. We are socially isolated from one another. We are in the middle of an extraordinary period of civil and social unrest and disquiet. And so I'm certainly happy to consider these things along with you when we have time to chat later in the program. I also want to suggest that some of what we're all feeling, the stress that we're feeling of being isolated from one another, even in situations like this, is relevant to this topic. And the conditions that have led to turmoil and to pain and anguish in our society are also related to how we think about development, where we invest, how we help, and what we promote. So I look forward to having that conversation, and I'm gonna switch here. And let's see. Give me one moment, please, to just. Oh, I know the problem. Sorry, guys. Why can I not? All right. Nope, didn't want to do that. Okay. All right, I apologize. So here's the frame within which I want to consider these topics. The architecture of the brain, I'm sorry, this is what I'm going to talk about. So neurodevelopmental science, the neurodevelopmental science of being human, resilience, risk, and the social brain. I will note parenthetically that I learned a lot of great things at Lawrence, and one of them was to always include a colon in the title. So I've maintained fidelity. As we begin to talk about it and think about it, here's the frame I want to do it within. The architecture of the brain is shaped by our early experiences. So the relationship between what we experience in the world in the first years of life and how our brains are built over time. And this occurs in the context of relationships, and part of the developmental logic of how we consider this and study it is that the skills that come first beget more skills, and those simpler skills support the development of more complex skills. And in this way, we can think about the brain being built almost like a house or a building, that you have to start with a sound foundation. And if you do that, then you can build steadily in complex ways. But if that foundation is not firm, then it will affect everything that comes later. The second important point here is that the human brain, indeed primate brains, are developed in the context of relationships. And judging from the registration that I saw, I believe there must surely be some parents and grandparents with us, aunts and uncles, and if nothing else, people interested in early development and who were themselves hopefully once children. And so part of what makes us human is this importance of relationships as our brains develop. And there are some interesting reasons for that. And it runs something like this. Even before we're born, of course, tremendous complex development is occurring, and especially in the brain. But the brain develops in a sequence, almost like concentric circles, so that the kinds of skills and abilities and that are most fundamental are developed early. More complex things like the structures that'll support emotion, vigilance, and more complex functioning next. And then finally, the higher cognitive functions that make us distinctly human. And the structure that we need to do that is a large and complex brain. And if you think about it from an evolutionary context, it is that that large, sophisticated brain that allows us to be social and that confers advantage. So if we think about the selection pressures early in our development as a species, what advantage did we have? What could we do? We weren't the fastest, we weren't the strongest, we didn't have big teeth. So what did we have going for us? Well, we had a large complex brain and the ability to use complex social systems. In order to do that, we need a big brain, and we need a brain that has time to develop. And all of that development cannot happen in utero, or we would not have a successful birth and we'd go extinct. And so in a sense, the evolutionary logic was, well, let's go ahead and birth this being, and then we'll carry them around for a while. So humans are born extraordinarily helpless over and against other mammals. The newborn infant is not able to provide the stimulation necessary for normal brain growth by his or herself. So this little baby, as adorable as she is not able to seek out interesting stimuli. She's not able to go and find interesting people to talk to and to look at and to learn from. She's completely dependent on the adults that are taking care of her. And so this more complex part of the brain that develops later does so needing that stimulation and needing the responsiveness of the environment. And so humans have this long period of dependency on adults, and we've evolved as adults to feel a strong commitment to what we would consider love, to protect and care for that infant. And for us to survive and thrive, both these things must be true. We need to be able, in a sense, it's sort of the idea of the fourth trimester, that we're born extraordinarily immature. That moment of birth was a change of address, but the brain is still very much developing and very dependent on the world around it. And as adults and caregivers, we feel a commitment, we feel compelled to care for and engage the infant. And off we go. So I'm going to talk a bit about what helps and what hurts early on, but that's really not a very sensible question if we don't know what are the normative, salient developmental tasks that should be occurring in the first few years of life. And first, of course, the task of the newborn, as it were, is physiological regulation. They're now exposed to sights and sounds, to variations of environmental conditions, a day and a night, and needing to actively find nourishment and so all of these very basic processes are the first things that develop and that are wired together, and this happens, as all development does, through a process of neuronal blooming and pruning and integrating. In other words, and I'm going to talk a bit about this, although we are born with nearly the full complement of neurons that we'll have throughout our life, what changes, what grows, what molds are the synaptic connections between neurons, and that is happening across all of these domains. If you think about the world of an infant in the first year of life, they're not concerned about COVID. They're not concerned about social unrest. They're not concerned about the election in the fall. The entirety of their world, everything that matters, is the holding environment in which they find themselves and that they're developing. And so the kind of central question in that first year is the world a trustworthy place or is it not? When I'm distressed, does it respond, and try to soothe me? When I'm happy, is that delight shared with someone else? When I'm sleepy, does the environment help me to calm down and go to sleep? And so all of these things, which are the core work of that first year of life, happen in the context of what we call the attachment relationship. And this is an evolutionarily driven, universal development in which the infant is pre-wired to form a differential attachment to one or few caregivers. And the caregivers in turn are engaged in that task, and a dyad is created, a relationship. Not one thing, not the other thing, but both things together. And that, when things go well and normatively, establishes a secure base in which all the other developmental tasks occur, and we can begin to explore the world. And then a bit later in those first few years, as we begin to explore the world, we develop more complex cognitive functions so that we can control, direct, inhibit, engage the world around us. So the attachment relationship is foundational, and it links to all of these things, to cognitive development, which is why it develops sort of later in the first year of life in a predictable, measurable way, because we need to have developed object permanence. We need to know things exist in order to miss them or wish for them. It promotes exploration of the world. It is the prototype of a relationship. It's the first relationship. It's what we internalize as what the nature of a relationship is. And that occurs because it's emotion or affect that is managed. As I said, being soothed when you're troubled, sharing delight. And so the bond is an affective bond, an emotional bond. It's not based in what we remember, it's based in what we experience. And a process begins that's sometimes described as a serve and return process. And in a sense, this is the fundamental cycle that drives development forward. That I said that the developing brain is dependent on the environment and on experience. So here's an example, and we sometimes call this a serve and return. This very adorable, and I can hear you oohing and eyeing almost, baby is 2 weeks old. Take a look at what's happening. Take a look at this lovely mom looking at this lovely baby, and look at the gaze between them at 2 weeks. This baby, even though can't manage to put her hand in her mouth, is able to do this, able to lock in. And can't you just feel the power between those things? It's almost like a fiber optic cable carrying emotion, cognition, relationship. It's all there and occurring in real time. So the mom's delighted. She serves up this broad smile and delighted face. It's in high relief, which allows the baby to read that signal. And you can see the beginnings of the response. Her eyes begin to widen. She begins to smile. And now she's matching this face and, important to note, the motion of her mom. Now she's only 2 weeks old and she can't sustain this for too long. And so the arc begins to complete and she begins to settle back down. And then that, in a sense, she has served that up. And mom responds in a reciprocal fashion, and her expression changes. Now, all of this happens in instants. You don't even know what's happening. We don't have to know. We're wired to do it, and it begins with these simple cycles like this, and will become more complex over time. Now, what's actually happening at a neurological level is something like this. So we say experience shapes the brain. Shapes the brain architecture by overproducing these synaptic connections and then pruning them. Looking at this slide reminds me that I meant to say at the beginning that much of this work comes within the context of partnership between Children's Hospital Minnesota, where I work, the University of Minnesota's Institute of Child Development, and the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. That is the home of a consortium I'll talk a bit more about later. So that's why you're seeing these different names: Children's Minnesota, University of Minnesota, and the Harvard Center on these slides. So at birth, as I said, we have almost our full complement of neurons, but they are not connected with each other in a very complex way. So what happens through the first several years of life is that we throw out all kinds of synaptic connections. Basically, everything we might need, right? All the wiring we might need. All the different parts of the brain begin to connect in sequence. But then this happens, this is biologically driven, but it's experience that acts on this. And experience then leads to this, which is the pruning that occurs. So in a sense, this slide or this image doesn't reflect something less optimal than this. This slide represents efficiency. And so we strengthen the connections that we need for our culture, for healthy development, for our language and things like that. And we drop away those things that we don't need. And we create a more integrated, complex, and efficient neurological system. Another way to think about this is the ways in which the neural circuits of the brain begin to wire together. And so, systems of the brain that act together begin to wire together. And as I was saying before, the first thing to wire together are the sensory pathways. And so, this is a commonly used slide to explain this, and I really like it. And the key here is that this trajectory isn't showing us the number of neurons. It's showing us something about the number of synaptic connections. So in terms of vision and sight, being able to take all that in and create an automatic way to process those things, the first thing that's happening in development. And then as the slope comes down, that is where we begin to prune away what we don't need. And it begins with at a sensory level. And the next really interesting, and I wish I had more time to talk about it because it is so fun, is the development of language. And so here, what this represents is that very early on, if you think about an infant, they're hearing a lot of language, and that does matter, but they're not producing a lot of sounds, differentiated sounds. But as they begin to babble, and they begin to generate all the different phonemes, individual sounds that they'll need, in order to develop language. And so, especially, sort of between this sort of 4-month period and around the 10th month period, there's this explosion of synaptic connection. And what that reflects is that explosion of sounds. But then the environment acts, and so we like to say that at this age, the infant is a citizen of the world. They're remaining not only every phoneme they'll need for every language in the world, but every language that ever existed. But depending on what they hear, then that begins to shape. And so they reinforce the sounds that they'll need, the rhythm, the prosody, or sort of the sound of the language are reinforced, and all of the sounds they don't need for that language drop away, and that's what this reflects. And finally, higher cognitive functions, things like executive functioning, the ability to direct attention, to delay action, to kind of put things together in sequence, develops more gradually. And so that by the time kids are entering school, they begin to that's the focus of attention. And if you think about it, if you're a kindergarten teacher really doesn't care that much about whether a kid knows letters, and math and reading. It's nice, but it doesn't really matter that much. What does matter is the ability to control oneself, to listen, to engage in group tasks, and so forth. And then all of that learning occurs. So we're kind of focused on these first few years of life, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to note here that this slide represents how open the brain is to experience, and why, in a sense, we care so much about early development. So early in development, the brain's ability to change in response to experiences is tremendous. And then over time, it requires a lot more effort from the environment in order to change the brain. So it can happen, and it does happen. We learn new things, to be sure. We learn complex things. But in terms of the stability and organization of the brain, this is where a lot of the action is. Now, the opening of these circuits is sometimes referred to as neuroplasticity. In other words, the brain is relatively plastic. It can change in shape. You can learn Mandarin, you can learn English, you can learn Spanish without effort. It just gets wired that way. And the last slide reflected what we call critical periods. There are times when these circuits are open and receptive to the environment, and then they begin to they begin to close, which is not a bad thing. We need that stability. We need to have all the sounds we need for a language in order to begin to learn to form words, and then complex constructs in phrases and in sentences. But it also means that it's a time of opportunity and of risk. So anything that promotes healthy brain development early on, you're getting tremendous bang for your buck, as it were. But anything that interferes with healthy and normal brain development early on is causing changes that will affect health and well-being over time also. And then finally, this process doesn't look exactly the same for everybody in every environment. So there are important individual differences, that reflect genetic, temperament, parenting style, culture, and all kinds of other kinds of reasons. All right. I want to kind of do a slightly abrupt shift into stress. I don't mean stress necessarily inherently as a bad thing. I simply mean that part of being in the world is being confronted with challenge and having to adapt to that challenge, to perceive and act and create sort of a behavioral arc in response to what happens around us. That is not a bad thing. In fact, it has great evolutionary importance. We have to be able to perceive threat in the environment and then mobilize action at a biological level and behavioral level to respond to that threat. And then reestablish equilibrium afterwards. So this process of how our biology responds to stressful circumstances and then how we re-establish that equilibrium developed in a very different world than the one we live in now. And so it's important that at times like this, we begin to think about, well, how is this system built and how does it work in this context in 2020, not 40,000 years ago? And the neurobiology of that stress is a really important part of this developmental story. And I'm not going to go into sort of these neurobiological processes, except to say that this HPA axis is basically a summary of that stress biology, of the fight or flight system that kicks in when we're on alert. And that there's an important relationship between that very sort of core brain sort of biological response to threat and the prefrontal cortex, which is a more complex, higher functioning part of the brain. And the relationship is this. Early in development, we have this stress biology system coming online, but we really do not have the cognitive ability to evaluate very accurately what is threatening and what is not threatening in the environment. And that's where that attachment relationship comes in. Because because the way this works is that secure attachment relationship, that individual is almost inserted into this process. They're the buffer between that stress biology and the perception of and interpretation of the world. So a 7-month-old infant is not supposed to be evaluating whether the caregiver is likely to be loving or abusive at any given moment. They're not equipped to do that. But if they experience an environment in which that threat is real and it's it's not mediated, it's not buffered by the caregiver, then the prefrontal cortex and that core stress biology system begin to wire together too soon. So it's not whether it wires together, it's when it wires together. And that is really the story of what we've come to call toxic stress. So early adversity in life increases the risk for later problems in learning, behavior, and health for those developmental reasons that I talked about. That adversity gets under the skin through the activation of the stress response system. And excessive activation in those systems in the absence of a buffering relationship can be toxic by affecting brain development and physiological functioning. I don't really like to talk about the effects of stress early in development without throwing in this slide, because as I was saying before, not all stress is bad. There's positive stress. Learning to walk and you fall down, and then your parent kind of laughs and you laugh and you get up and you try again. That's causing fluctuations in that stress response system, but it's good. Needing to wait and then have what you need become delivered creates really sort of the ability to delay gratification, to anticipate good things that are coming. So building that stress response system in that way is like building a healthy immune system. You need to be exposed to some stress in order to develop the ability to adapt and respond. And we're a very hardy species, so we can even tolerate huge disruptions if they're temporary and they're in the context of supportive relationships. If we're a child and we're displaced from our home because of a hurricane, there's nothing good about that, and it's very stressful for everybody. But we're built to handle it. We are a very resilient species. I like to say we lived in the Ice Age, we live in deserts, we live in mountains. We can tolerate a lot if it's temporary and it's buffered. The idea of toxic stress, which you've heard some about perhaps, is when that stress is prolonged and it's in the absence of the protective relationships that we need. I'm going to skip that. It didn't work when I ran through this. And I want to briefly just sort of talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing here in Minnesota and around the country. We're part of a consortium of pediatric centers, of academic institutions, and community programs, working together to understand the effects of excessive early adversity, to learn how it affects the developing physiological system and behavioral systems, and how to support healthier development and bring interventions to bear over time that are helpful. This slide just indicate that this is an effort across the country and into Canada of those three entities working together. It's centered at the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, and it's really been quite a wonderful relationship between our hospital here in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, and Harvard. And I would say the same is true around the country with a number of different institutions. The research over the past 5 years of this group is looking at how stress affects several things. One is stress biology, how it affects the development of the brain, and how it affects things like the immune system and the integrity of cellular function, and how these things relate to later physical and mental health. Here at the University of Minnesota, we have a series of studies together, here at the Children's Minnesota, along with the University of Minnesota and our colleagues in this consortium, in this network. We're looking at some of the behavioral consequences of those protective relationships early on, and the sources of potential stress that interferes with development. And so I just wanted to indicate that, you know, some of the kinds of things that we're looking at are the ways in which the quality of attachment buffers stress in infants. We're looking at the way in which adversity in the form of, say, for example, poverty, interferes with the beginnings of more complex cognitive development. So joint attention, for example, that moment when the parent sees something out the window and says, "Oh, look, honey, the mailman's here," and the infant turns to look. And then later on, when the toddler wants to get the attention focused on something that they want, and they point to it, and then the caregiver points to it. Believe it or not, that is fundamental to all kinds of later complex cognitive functioning. So we're looking at that, and some of those later functions like executive functioning, and we're working on ways to measure in a more efficient manner, not measure so much, but screen for problems in that attachment relationship. So I promised to talk about risk and resilience, and I think it's been sort of part of what I've had to say. So I just will take a moment here to say some of the research through this group, through this toxic research network, is beginning to show the ways in which the quality of parenting mediates outcomes of early adversity, including poverty. So we can think of this as measuring risk and the consequences of risk. Some of the things that we see specifically are the ways in which a secure attachment relationship or an insecure attachment relationship mediates stress biology. That's what this refers to. In infants living under conditions of poverty. So this is federal poverty line. This was a bit a study that we did here at Children's with our colleagues. And the very, very short story is that the more the environmental stress under circumstances like poverty, the more the infant is dependent on a secure attachment relationship to mediate that stress. And so, you know, with certain kinds of stressors, even a relatively small amount can have a large effect when it occurs in the conditions of general poverty and general adversity. I actually mentioned this, that socioeconomic differences early in development, none of this is determinative, but it creates higher risk for the caregivers being stressed, for not having time and resources to dedicate to these early developmental tasks, things that look like they're not very high tech, but really are important to development, like playing, like sharing playtime, reading stories. These all build joint attention, and we are beginning to be able to demonstrate the differences between, or I should say the interaction between early stress and quality of relationship. And this was a study not done here, but part of the network, which I think is a very nice example of the breadth and depth of what we're learning. And this was a study done in Los Angeles and Boston by some of our colleagues, which was able to demonstrate the relationship between the perception of stress during pregnancy on the part of the mother and EEG patterns of infants, 2-month-old infants. So think about this for a moment. The sense of being stressed while pregnant, which might mean living under, you know, conditions of abuse or poverty or other kinds of challenge, is manifest later on in the individual infant. And because of the advances of technology and imaging, they're able to actually look at the power or strength of neurons firing that are reflected in the EEG. So that not just where things are firing, but the quality of firing. When you think about we talk about, and especially in Minnesota and under these circumstances, things like the achievement gap. And then there are those of us that prefer to think of it as an opportunity gap. You can begin to see that if you're not starting from a level playing field, you're beginning to potentially fall behind, not when you get to school, way before you get to school. But I promise to end on a hopeful note. And it's really the other side of that coin, that the quality of parenting mediates the outcomes of early adversity, including poverty. In other words, sensitive and responsive parenting is associated with better outcomes across all developmental domains. And secure attachment in particular buffers early brain development and helps to build and leads to healthy development and healthy behavioral outcomes across the lifespan. I want to just include a couple of, and I just want to include a couple of places you could go if this is interesting to you and you want to learn more. And one of the things that the Harvard Center for the Developing Child has worked hard on for a number of years with many experts is how to translate the neurodevelopmental science into formats that are engaging and accessible for interested and motivated just people in our world that want to learn more about this. And so I would encourage you to check out the Harvard Center for Developing Child's website. It is a treasure trove of all the kinds of things and many more things that I tried to share with you today. There are more detailed reports if that's what you're interested in, but also brief videos, summary papers. You can find information on a podcast that they have if you like to learn about these things as you're driving into work when you're doing that again. And then also links to some interesting longer pieces, documentary and longer kind of TED Talk types of presentations on these topics. And so I commend those things to you, and I look forward to conversation that we will have here coming up. So Shana,